Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I am very excited to bring the conversation I had with Jacob Mchangama. Jacob is the founder and executive director of the Future of Free Speech. He's also a research professor at Vanderbilt University and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also known as FIRE. Jacob has written and commented extensively on free speech and human rights all over the world, and many places such as The Economist, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, BBC, and many, many other outlets, as well as in top-tier academic and peer-reviewed journals. He's also the producer and narrator of the podcast Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech, and an author of the now critically acclaimed book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. And that book, and generally free speech, is what we talk about. We start by talking about what is free speech, what that looks like here and in Europe kind of broadly. We talk about the limits of free speech and the ethics of free speech. I say we probably spend a good 30 to 45 minutes kind of on this part. The first part of the conversation is very much about free speech. We talk about what he calls the free speech recession. We talk about the origins of free speech. And then we just kind of track how free speech has evolved through time, going to the Athenian and Roman empires, the Abbasid Caliphate. We talk about ancient India, the printing press, the Enlightenment, John Stuart Mill. And then we talk about what free speech looks like now in the 21st century, and as we continue to progress through the 21st century. And many other topics. It was a wide-ranging conversation. I think it was over 90 minutes, and it was just a treat. I haven't talked about free speech kind of directly head-on. Of course, it will come up in conversation here on the podcast, so nobody I could really think about other than Jacob to talk about it with, and I wanted to talk to him for a couple years. He was very generous to come on. He was very lovely. I really enjoyed my conversation with him. He's a very, very nice guy. He's obviously very brilliant. And it's one of the, still continues, free speech continues to be one of the values that's defining for a moment. And so his work is truly invaluable, and really, really, really loved having him on. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so subscribe to the Substack, share with your friends, and now I bring you Jacob Mchangama. I am here with Jacob Mchangama. Jacob, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, me as well. I've heard about you through mutual friends and colleagues, and so you come highly recommended, which is nice. I've obviously read your book, which was fantastic. The name of that book is Free Speech: A History from Socrates to Social Media. This is out through the wonderful Basic Books. This is in paperback now, right? I think the hardcover was a couple years old now.
Yeah, it came out. The hardcover was, 2022, and the paperback just came out last month with a new epilogue. So
very nice, very nice. So we're gonna talk all about free speech, which is an always important topic, but has become more in the media and the news and things like that, and something that people are thinking about the past few years. Before we do, just kind of give listeners a snapshot of who you are, professionally, academically, or anything else, and I guess how you came to settle on this topic to write 500 pages on it.
So I was born and raised in Copenhagen, Denmark.
Really?
Yeah.
I literally just came back from there last week.
Oh, wow.
I was my first time there. It's a lovely city. It's very nice. It's very nice. That's cool to hear.
And I think for most of my life, or sort of my youth, in my 20s, I took free speech for granted. Then 20 years ago, a Danish newspaper published a number of cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad, and that turned into a whole thing. A global sort of crisis erupted, where free speech and religion clashed, you might say. And some of my friends now had to live with round-the-clock security. And I think that really got me hooked on free speech, made me go down the rabbit hole of exploring where this freedom comes from, what it means, what it entails. And since then, I've only kept digging and gone further down the rabbit hole. Never managed to climb back up.
Mm-hmm. This is different. This, I guess, incident you're talking about, is this different from the Charlie Hebdo incident?
Yeah, it precedes it. In fact, I think you can say that the Charlie Hebdo would probably not have happened, the attack, had it not been because of the Jyllands-Posten, this Danish newspaper, because Charlie Hebdo was one of relatively few newspapers that actually republished the cartoons in solidarity with the Danish newspaper. And then Charlie Hebdo were first firebombed in 2011, and then the deadly attack took place 5 years ago. 10 years ago, sorry. 10 years ago. Wow, time flies.
Well, yeah. I guess, what was the incident, I guess? I mean, I have a very loose memory of this, but
so it's essentially Muslim majority states experienced a lot of riots, deadly riots. Danish embassies were attacked, destroyed. There was threats of sanctions and boycotts. Al-Qaeda dispatched various people to try and kill cartoonists. Some escaped into a panic room when an axe-wielding vigilante forced himself into his house. And so it's just been an ongoing. It's been an ongoing issue that's never been totally resolved, and it just meant that free speech became a geopolitical issue for Denmark and really the world, because it sort of became round two, you might say, of the Rushdie affair. And what interested me was that a lot of people in Denmark, in the West, were suddenly saying, well, free speech is important, but you can't abuse it to punch down on a vulnerable minority. And even as people, I tend to think of people who are willing to kill with AK-47s or suicide bombs as not being particularly vulnerable, at least not vulnerable when they're sort of the weaker part, when they're confronting a cartoonist who uses a pen. So I thought I saw some weaknesses, in the traditional heartland of free speech in open democracies that were being taken advantage of by people, states, organizations who cared very little about free speech, that wanted religion and religious doctrines to actually stand above free speech, which is pretty much the complete opposite of how open societies are supposed to work.
We don't have to stay on this too long. I'm a little bit curious. I mean, I literally just got back, so it's very interesting. Only positive things to say about Denmark. I really enjoyed my time there, and it's very lovely. I'm curious, what's the free speech piece here? What is the sort of pulse or public opinion that the Danes have of free speech, and how is, I guess, that different from maybe other parts of Western Europe or the United States and Canada? I mean, what's the difference here? I mean, because, again, as a visitor, it seemed people were nice, they were friendly, they were inviting, they were,
Well, they were. I mean, that's, moving from Denmark to the south in the U.S., I would say, Danes are definitely more cold and introverted, and Americans tend to be much more open and friendly and welcoming. There's a lot of good things to say about Denmark and Copenhagen, but most people don't come back saying that, oh, the Danes were just open and.
I found them very nice. Very nice, very friendly.
Delighted to hear that. Yeah.
But I guess on the free speech thing, what's the public sentiment?
Yeah, so we actually just 2 or 3 weeks ago put out a survey of attitudes towards free speech in the 33 countries around the world, and Denmark came out second after Norway The U.S. had actually dropped to 9th from 3rd. In general, Danes are very supportive of free speech. We don't have as strong, robust free speech protections as the U.S., constitutionally speaking. But during the cartoon crisis, the Danish government held firm, did not want to sort of tell a newspaper what it could publish. But in recent years, I think various governments have eroded free speech protections in Denmark, including the reintroduction of basically a blasphemy ban, which makes it a crime to it essentially is aimed at preventing the burning or desecration of Qurans, but protects sacred writings, which is again, it feels like we're moving back in time. But I guess that's basically the Danish government saying we're tired of having these threats against national security, about vigilantes wanting to disrupt Danish society, kill people, about foreign states applying pressure to us. Now let's just take a little slice of free speech and hope for peace. I think that's a very naive undertaking.
I know that there's. I spent a day in Malmo, Sweden, and it's a much different story there in Sweden. The neighbors across the Sound are, they have a different story. I think a little bit. I mean, Copenhagen in Denmark seems to be very safe. Appears to be. Less so, I guess, in Sweden. I mean, do you this idea of we take a little slice of free speech, to kind of not have maybe some types of violence or things like that, or the threat of violence, when you look next door to Sweden, maybe it's a little bit of a different story. I mean, everyone's going to do this a little different. I mean, how do you practically? I mean, what do you make of this?
I mean, interestingly enough, in Sweden very recently, so they had these two Iraqi Christian refugees who also burned Qurans as a protest, I guess, against Islamic fundamentalism. And they were charged with hate speech, incitement to hatred under Swedish law. But a couple of days before the verdict, one of these people was assassinated in his apartment. He was shot and killed. And still, a few days after, the guy that he was burning Qurans with was convicted and fined. So first, the state punishes, vigilantes, criminals, religious fundamentalists punish one person through extrajudicial means that the state is unable to stop, even though it has charged these people, and then the state punishes the other person. I think that really shows the folly of appeasement when it comes to what I call the jihadist veto. But it's true that Sweden, I mean, compared to most countries around the world, Sweden is still quite safe. But it's certainly true that they have more violent and serious crime than Denmark, and it's a big issue.
Well, you give a history, and you go all the way back in time. Obviously, we won't cover all of the history. People should buy the book. It's great. It's a nice kind of one-stop shop for sort of history of free speech, and it's not only just history. Of course, it is various components of everyday life. So we'll pick out some themes from this. I guess the first kind of big thing here is, I mean, some people have said this, and at different points here in the States about free speech being this type of master value. That if you don't have free speech, like if you don't have the ability to say what you want, you're of sorts impacting the way you're thinking about things and the way you're behaving about things, and it really is. We need freedom. At least in the States, you have free to assemble and free of religion, and but freedom of speech is you can't have anything really else than if you don't have free speech. And so, I mean, for you, do you see free speech as this sort of master value of all values of sorts? How do you see it in terms of the sort of a hierarchy or primacy of free speech?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on what kind of society you want to live in. If you want to live in a theocratic state, then free speech is not the master value. Then it's whatever religious doctrine your community. If you want to live in a totalitarian state, it's the political ideology and so on. But if you want to live in a democratic state, then I would say that free speech is what you call the master value and the most important human right. And I think, there are all these discussions, why free speech? What's the main justification? I don't think you need to have one single free speech theory to rule them all. I think there are a number of strong justifications for free speech, and they tend to be mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. So free speech is, I think, bound up with democracy and representative government. I think it would be very difficult to have any meaningful public discussion of politics without free speech. If we were unable to criticize politicians and their laws, democracy would sort of degenerate into a Potemkin village. It would no longer be meaningful. But I think, free speech is also absolutely essential for individual freedom, human rights, and without free speech, none of our other rights and freedoms would be safe. And so I would say, even if you're more concerned about privacy or the right to fair trial or torture, what's your most important weapon in the fight for or against these things? It's free speech, right? If you combat torture, you need free speech to be able to shine a light on torture, to advocate for change. Same thing when it comes to privacy. You need free speech you need to have a free press to be able to disclose the leaks by Edward Snowden to show the extent of mass surveillance by the American security apparatus, for instance. So in that sense, it's empowering. But I also think, when it comes to equality, free speech is also absolutely essential, because if a particular group is allowed to control speech, it will typically use that power for its own benefits and to the exclusion of other groups. So in that sense, you could call it a meta right, really, for a free and open society.
Let me ask about something I think about a lot, is the limits of free speech.
Yeah.
The bounds, the far reaches of free speech. I guess I'll just ask a closed-ended question here. I don't usually like doing those, but are there limits to free speech? And if so, what do you think those are? Because I feel like if I ask 10 people, I'm going to get 10 different answers. If I ask 10 different organizations, I'm going to maybe get 10 different definitions.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily looking for a universalist answer, but generally, yes, are there limits? And what do you think those limits should be or are based on how we define or accept free speech in, let's say, democratic societies?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things that we try to tease out in this global survey that I referenced of attitudes in 33 countries around the world. And what you see there is that there's a pretty high universal acceptance of free speech as an important freedom around the world. But then when you ask people whether free speech should take priority over supposedly clashing or conflicting values, you see huge differences between countries and sometimes also within various demographics in the same country. One thing that is sort of tends to be universally agreed upon is that sort of clear incitement to violence, for instance, should not be protected by speech. That's true even in the U.S., even though the bar is very high for when you reach the threshold of incitement. But that tends to be universally agreed in all countries. Then there are also categories like fraud. If I were to send you an email and successfully defrauded you of your life savings, very few people would say, well, that's okay because Jacob was just exercising his free speech. But I guess one important distinction that became sort of very prominent during the early modern era, especially in the Enlightenment, is try to distinguish between words and actions. To a certain extent, you might say it's a artificial distinction between because if I move my lips, you could say that's an action as well. But there's a difference between me saying, I wish you were dead, and me pulling out a gun and shooting you in the face. Mm-hmm. And so that's, I think, is a quite important distinction.
Let me ask this. These are kind of connected. So, yeah, and I've heard this. I mean, incitement to violence. I mean, that feels fuzzy and kind of nebulous of sorts. I mean, what do we? And I think you're right. I mean, in the United States, that has a pretty low ceiling. I mean, and or high ceiling. I'm sure you're
high ceiling. Yeah.
High ceiling. Other places less so.
Yeah.
I mean, this is hard to. If I say, hey, look, you should go out into the street and shoot the third person you see, is that incitement to violence? If I say, well, here's the address to this person, go shoot him in the face, is that incitement to violence? And other people would say, well, no, I mean, that's just, free speech. You can say what you want. And it's just, I find that people agree, yeah, there's limits. And then when you start asking things, it's like, well, no, that's not it. Well, yeah, not quite. And I don't have an answer, so I'm curious of where's that limit there with that.
But and I think so. The U.S. limit when it comes to incitement is, as you said, quite high. So it has to be incitement to imminent lawless action, which is also likely to produce such an outcome. So imminence is important, right? It's not enough to say, "Oh, be great if you went out and shot someone." That's not incitement to imminent lawless action, but also likely to produce such an outcome. So, if I say something that could be interpreted as incitement to imminent violence, the context matters, right? If it's clear from the context that I was just joking or shitposting, then the interpretation of it will be different. But one way to think about it is, last year here in Nashville, there were these out groups of people from out of state that came, neo-Nazis, tried to get attention by, standing with swastikas, chanting hateful, racist, anti-Semitic things, I think sometimes even protesting outside synagogues. Now, that is obviously hurtful to a lot of people. You can imagine being Jewish and going to synagogue or out of a synagogue and you see Nazis with swastikas there. But that's not incitement to violence in the sense that it will be punishable in the U.S. If, on the other hand, there's a group of neo-Nazis standing outside a synagogue armed with baseball bats, and the ringleaders said, let's go get the Jews, then you're in the territory of incitement to imminent violence. That's also likely to produce such an outcome.
So this goes to this whole thing of, I mean, I'm sure you've heard this of sorts, and I've resisted against this, although there's a separate ethical question which we can come to, but is words are violence, right? I'm sure you've heard this, right? Words are violence, and I don't agree with that. I think that's garbage. I understand what people mean, but how do we have this? You talked about kind of sort of during the Enlightenment period, this kind of came online, but of this idea that if you're going to present imminent risk or something to somebody, but just words alone aren't violent, right? You need actions with them. I mean, how do we understand? Yeah. What's your counters to these sorts of claims that people make about words being violent?
Yeah, I think it's often sloppy thinking, right? I made the example before that most people, would be able to distinguish between me saying, I want to kill you, and me pulling out a gun and shooting you in the face. That's a very, very clear difference that with very different outcomes. But if you want to be charitable and steelman the position of those who say words of violence, it's clear that words are needed and precede, especially large-scale violence. It would be very difficult to organize a genocide or, a pogrom or crimes against humanity without speech coordinating it, planning it, inciting it, and so on. So words very often precede that. But if I'm confronted with, if 100 people are confronted with hateful rhetoric and incitement to violence, it does not necessarily mean that those 100 people are automatically going to react to it, right? You have agency as the recipient of words. And that also goes to when you talk about hate speech. If someone calls me a racist epithet, you can be offended or you can laugh it off. There are all kinds of ways that you can react to it. So in that sense, as human beings, we have agency. We can interpret it. Whereas if someone who is a racist, called me slurs, I might get offended. I might get hurt, or I might just laugh it off and say that reflects more on you than it does on me, that you'd hate someone because of the color of someone's skin. That generally I tend to think that reflects more on the racist than on the target of racist invectives. Mm-hmm. But if that person runs up to me on the street and pulls out a baseball bat and cracks my skull open, that's a very different story, right? That's a very tangible, immediate harm where I don't have any opportunity to sort of interpret it. There's no agency for me to sort of well, there's no two ways about it, right? That is violence, a very immediate, direct harm against me that a racist epithet may not necessarily be. Mm. And you also, if you equate words with violence, then you can sort of put people on the spot, because then you'd say, okay, so if you now said something to me that I found to constitute violent. Would you be okay if I responded by punching you in the face? Yeah. And most people will say no, because it's their subjective definition of speech that they equate with violence. So if, for instance, you're very likely to see situations where different minority groups feel very differently about types of speech. So you have trans activists who think that dead naming people is akin to violence, or even I sometimes seem sort of you're denying my humanity. This is incitement to genocide. I tend to think that's not a very solid argument. Whereas if you went out on the streets and you attacked trans people physically, that's a very different story. And we see it now in after October 7th. Jewish groups being concerned about their safety, they say, well, if you shout from the river to the sea, that is incitement to genocide against Jews and Israelis. But those who shout those words may not necessarily. Some of them might be, they might be Hamas supporters who generally want to destroy Israel and kill Jews. But many others might just be sort of leftist activists who are very critical of the state of Israel think that Palestinians are being treated badly, and who might have envisioned, one state encompassing Jews and Palestinians. So there's interpretation there, right? And the more we're sort of emotionally invested in it, the more likely are we to say that words are violence when it sort of affects ourselves. But when it's groups that we don't have the same affinity for, or if it's groups that we loathe, we tend to make excuses for ourselves. We say, well, we can use that type of language against other people, and it's not violence.
But you would agree, though, that words do have power, or they potentially have power.
Of course. I mean, some of the, and also, words can hurt deeply, right? They can inflict intense emotional pain.
Yeah, it's a verbal or emotional abuse. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but, what are the worst words you could hear? It might be, I don't love you anymore, right? Mm-hmm. If you're married and your spouse tells you, I don't love you anymore, mm-hmm. I want a divorce. Mm-hmm. That's probably, some of the worst emotional pain you could hear. But no one would argue that you should ban that. Like, you should have the right to say
violence.
That.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. And then there might be specific concrete instances. So, if you're the boss and you're in a work environment and you bully and harass your employees, then you might say, well, there are work environment laws that limit speech in this particular context, that does not impinge on free speech more generally, and which I think is fine. But in general, I think for the reasons I just listed and many more that we could get into, I think the idea of equating words with violence is dangerous, and one that the proponents of it very often will have very subjective ideas of what types of speech constitutes violence, and will not be open to someone retorting with violence to their words.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think it's a way too slippery slope. There's not really an off ramp, and so that's why I mostly am against that idea.
Yeah. But again, that is not to say that you can't show empathy and understanding for people who do, who are hurt by words, and that words can, the old saying that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, I think is flat out wrong.
Mm. Now, you at least here in the States or in most democracies, you have hate speech, however you want to define that, broadly or narrowly, is protected under free speech, yes?
Well, in the U.S., there's no hate speech exception. Like I said, it's the Brandenburg case from 1969 on incitement to imminent lawless action. Mm-hmm. But in just about every other democracy, there are limits there are restrictions on hate speech. Mm. But one of the problems with that is that it's very difficult to have any meaningful definition of hate speech. Yeah. And that very often hate speech restrictions will be used by whoever is in power to essentially support their worldview and go after those who challenge them. And very often we've also seen, and this is a recurrent theme in my book, that laws that restrict speech, and including hate speech restrictions, are being used against the minorities that they were supposed to protect.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I do wonder, though, how much of that is a bit, at least in the modern time, country specific. I mean, I think when you think about a country like Germany, who, 75 years ago, did some horrible things to one group of people. I mean, if they, I think it's, in a sense, with that historical context, not from 500 years ago or 200 years ago. We're still talking less than 100 years ago. There's still people living that went through some of those things. That some restrictions on what you say in that country, in that context. I mean, wouldn't that be? Maybe one wouldn't agree with it, but you could say, I get it.
Yeah.
That's reasonable, based on your recent history, no? Because United States doesn't have that history.
Well, I mean, let's unpack that. So let's go with Germany first.
Yeah.
So I spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about what I call the Weimar fallacy, a term that I've borrowed from Eric Heinze, a British scholar, though he uses it somewhat differently than me. So basically, Germany has this militant democracy now based on the idea that you have to root out threats to democracy and human dignity before they grow so strong that they can overthrow democracy and destroy democratic values and dignity, and essentially result in a rerun of Nazism. After all, Nazis came to power through democratic means. That's a compelling story, right?
Sure.
Never again do we want to go through what we went through with Nazism. So you can understand that impulse. I also, definitely understand why the Nazi Party and would be banned after World War II and so on. But when you delve into the history of the Weimar Republic, the short-lived democracy that preceded Nazism, sort of from 1918 to 1933, the story is actually not of a democracy that just had free speech for all and was naively complacent when it came to speech of those who rejected democracy. It was a democracy that adopted more and more draconian, drastic measures to combat the enemies of democracy, communists and Nazis. It was certainly more intolerant of left-wing threats than right-wing threats, but several leading Nazis, including Hitler himself, were banned from public speaking. Nazi newspapers were shut down. And the very constitution of the Weimar Republic allowed the president to suspend all civil liberties in an emergency. And that ultimately, that provision, which was supposed to protect democracy, was ultimately the one that the Nazis used to kill democracy when they were in power. After the Reichstag, the parliament building burned, Hitler convinced the president to sign a decree suspending all civil liberties, and that gave the Nazis democratic powers to essentially ban and imprison their democratic opponents. And that made it much easier to give a veneer of legality and democratic procedure to the establishment of a one-party state. So I don't buy that argument that that history shows us that the right way to fight Nazism and totalitarianism is through a militant democracy that heavily restricts free speech. Now, that is not to say that if the Weimar Republic had been more protective of speech, then the Nazis wouldn't have come into power. There are a lot of other and more important factors that help explain the rise of Nazism. But I think, if we agree that free speech is a fundamental right in a democracy, and it's something that you should only restrict when you have really strong reasons, and then you come up with a reason saying, well, history shows us that we need to do it in order to avoid cataclysmic outcomes like genocide and totalitarianism, and history actually, the historical record does not support that interpretation, then I don't think you've made a compelling argument for that course of action. And then we talk about the U.S. I mean, it's true that the U.S. has not in the 20th century had a genocide, but it certainly has had dark moments in its history, including slavery, including racial segregation. Yeah. And I think the U.S. has taken a different lesson from that. It has said, well, when it came to slavery, when it came to racial segregation, censorship and suppression was part and parcel of that. And those who challenged it were not only defending the principle of free speech, but also practiced free speech, often at very high costs. So Frederick Douglass is a great example, but the civil rights movement was instrumental in expanding the protections of the First Amendment to the status it has now. It was not, even though the First Amendment has this very absolutist language, you really have to get into the 20th century before it gets any real legal teeth, and you have to get to sort of the late 50s, early 60s before the really robust free speech protections that we enjoy today manifest themselves. And many of those sort of seminal landmark decisions were won by minorities, including, the civil rights movement. So John Lewis, the great, civil rights leader and congressman, said that without free speech and the First Amendment, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. I think that's a very sort of telling way. So America has drawn different lessons from its history than Europe, broadly speaking, has drawn from its history.
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, I think they're different. They're different histories, and Europe is old. It's the old world, so to speak, and it's older.
Yeah.
But
and it's also, there's a tradition. I think hierarchy plays into it. In many ways, American history is also one of saying we want to be done with the rigid hierarchies that that characterize the old world. We want a more egalitarian. It's a democratic, free society, and you see that very clearly in Madison's writings on free expression, where he very clearly distinguishes the First Amendment and the new American free speech tradition from the British free speech tradition from which it evolved, and sort of said, well, in Britain, you have this hierarchical class society where the betters enjoy protection from being criticized by the lower classes. That's not what we're trying to build here in the U.S. Now, of course, there were groups of people that Madison omitted, but the basic principle behind it is one that, and whereas the shift in Europe has been more gradual, and so you still have that more of an elitist free speech conception than in the U.S.
Let me ask you about responsibility here. I think a lot of times my view of it, in terms of how I perceive it, is many of the people, especially nowadays, that are clamoring on about free speech, in my view, don't have a lot of ethical responsibility for things. I can say whatever I want, and I can hide behind my shield of free speech, and you can't do anything for me, which is an ethical question, right? So it's a separate question of sorts. It's not a legal question. It's not even a rights question. So it is an ethical one. But I just throw it here in the mix here. I mean, if I tell you, hey, you know what? I think you're a fucking piece of shit. You know what? That's my free speech. You can't say anything to me. Or if I say, you know what? All the religions can go to hell, and say all these horrible things about all these people. But you know what? And you can go as far as you want on this, right?
Yeah.
I could literally say whatever I want and have no legal penalty. I could have, maybe some social, but, if I'm not, inciting violence with imminent risk, well, everything's fair game. And so, yeah, I mean, what do you think about, again, this is going to be different for everybody, but, I'm just, since, you've written about it and you've considered it a lot, this ethical responsibility people have with free speech. I don't think it should just be a Wild West of sorts and just be like, yep, you're not responsible for anything you say. I mean, how do we foster, how do you keep free speech, but how do you also foster some sense of, kind of ethical virtue or ethical responsibility there? And again, I'm not trying to necessarily make them dependent or a prerequisite, but that you aspire for that. How do you see that?
No, I think those are important considerations. I mean, hopefully, I don't know if you're a parent. I am.
Yes.
I obviously don't encourage my kids to run around and calling people all kind of horrible things. I try to instill a sense of being polite and engaging with other people in a respectful manner. Even though I'm a strong believer in free speech, I don't encourage them to just say whatever they think at any given moment. And also I will, if they speak in a way that I find inappropriate, there'll be consequences sometimes. So that obviously reflects that there are certain societal norms that we want to uphold. And, I think all of us self-censor daily.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for the proper functioning of a society. If I, said whatever popped into my head at any given moment when I walked down the street, or if I was on the subway in New York and someone smelled bad or whatever, didn't like their clothes, and if everyone did that all the time, the social glue of society would come unstuck. But that, as you sort of alluded to in the beginning, that's not really the function of the law to do that. That's ethical considerations. It's something that we want to inculcate from an early age on. Now, social media has made this much more of a burning question because previously it would be very, you wouldn't be in touch with people, you wouldn't have direct conversations with people in real time across the world or across the country in the way that you can now, and where you can have an audience of millions, and many of them will say all kinds of horrific things. What the organization that I run, the Future of Free Speech, have tried to do is to say, well, it's dangerous to give governments and even private corporations sort of centralized top-down power to combat the dark sides of online speech, for instance. So we've developed these toolkits of counter-speech that we that build on sort of research that shows how counter-speech can actually sometimes be an effective antidote to hatred and bigotry. And so we have trained hundreds of activists around the world in many different languages in how to use counter-speech, especially online. So that's one way of doing it. It's sort of a police, and there are different strategies. One of them is to sort of shame people. Another one is to show support to those who are on the receiving end. Others include humor. Then again, there are those that like sympathy, empathy. Daryl Davis is a great example, right? This black jazz musician who has, quote unquote, converted hundreds of members of the KKK and sort of made them leave that organization. And he's done so by, cultivating friendships with them, speaking to them person to person, and sort of that I think is a great example of using the empowering parts of free speech to combat the dark sides of free speech, if you like.
Yeah. I've talked to Daryl, and I've met him a few times. He's great. I think the problem with Daryl's kind of way of doing things is it just doesn't scale very fast.
Well, that's why that's why when you have these toolkits and you can do it, sort of create entire organizations of volunteers that do it online, it can actually have more of an effect. I also think providing social media users more control over what type of content they want to be confronted with is something that can help. Because you and I might have very different ideas of what is hateful or offensive, and so if you and I can better choose what kind of language we want to be confronted with, that empowers us, and we don't have to resort to sort of centralized restrictions or censorship. Having said all of that, I don't think we can ever get to sort of a speech nirvana. There will always be that, especially in a digital age. You will be confronted with stuff that sort of shakes your faith in in humankind, and sometimes leads you to question whether free speech is a good thing after all. But then I think, look at the alternative, and I think the alternative is a lot worse. I also actually think there's wisdom, ancient wisdom that you can use to navigate, the cesspit that social media can be sometimes. Stoicism, Buddhism are sort of good ways to detach yourself from words that might hurt you, and sort of say they're not me. These feelings that they created within me are not real. And also they say more about the speaker than they say about you. They own those words. They don't reflect me. I think the Buddha said something along the lines that anger has a honey-tipped but poisoned roots. So it sort of reflects that, that self-righteous anger that we can feel that leads us to unload on someone, can feel really good and satisfying at the moment, right? But it comes from a very dark place, and it sort of can poison our minds and also the ecosystem of people that we engage with, and we see that online. So if you are able to dissociate that, if you can stop sucking on the honey tip, and you can sort of cut the poison roots, then you can liberate yourself from the dark dynamics of that. And the more people who do that, well, the more likely you are to have a more conducive, enriching ecosystem of information and ideas.
Let me ask one other question here, more present, and then we can do some of the history. There's certain points in history I want to ask you about. I guess currently something I've been thinking about a lot more the past couple of years. You mentioned in the book as this free speech recession.
Yeah,
that's a nice way to say it. In the 2010s and 2020s now, this turn to authoritarianism has been interesting, to say the least. I think the question I have a lot of questions about it, but the thing with authoritarianism now in the world is that I like, just as from observing and studying, I guess, is what is the motivation for people en masse to go to that? I think so on a social psych level or sociological level. That's a very interesting question there, because it does feel of the time and moments. That's why you see so many people doing it, and it is a kind of collective piece to it. It's really interesting. But then the other thing is how it looks different in different parts of the world. So, Orban is different than Netanyahu, is different than Erdogan, is different than Putin, it's different than Trump, it's different than, I'm using this term loosely. I mean, some people are like, well, they're not really that way. That's fine. But this idea of this, at the very least, this strong man that takes this kind of rule with an iron fist, emphasis on law and order, and restrictions on many things, including free speech.
Yeah.
What do you make about that now of the current moment? I'm sort of asking this question backwards, because there's a whole long history here, which is what you write about. But I'm just kind of asking here, why in so many places, again, Hungary, Turkey, Iran, China, Russia, Israel, even the U.S. here, you're seeing there's a lot of parts of the world, different people groups. India's in there as well with Modi. What's going on here why are people ceding some of their freedom, especially free speech? And it's much worse in a lot of these countries. I mean, it's bad in Hungary and Turkey and Iran, and but we have our own pieces of it here too. But what do you make of this, right? Where people are going to say, like, that free speech stuff, I mean, and let me just make my footnote here. There are so many healthy, groups of people in these countries that don't like what's going on in their country, and they don't like their, administration, things like that. But I don't know. What do you make of that? Where people kind of just ceding the power of free speech to these kind of strong authoritarian people?
Yeah, so I mean, it's probably one of those questions that have a lot of contributing factors.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, if you take India or Hungary, actually Hungarians in our survey are and Venezuela as well, are in top 5 of people who support free speech. So that's a healthy sign, even though they've lost free speech. But I think probably for a large number of people in those countries, first of all, free speech can seem like an abstract and theoretical value. If you live with uncertainty, if you live with political instability, if you live with economic distress, sometimes it can even seem to be sort of a channeling some of those threats to values that you think are more important. But also, it might be that for some that they don't view, they don't see free speech, their own free speech, as being threatened, right? If you're on the side of the strong man in place, you can say whatever you want. It's the enemies, it's those who undermine the purity of the nation, its basic values, the outsiders funded by the Jews or the American CIA or the usual suspects, who have their free speech restricted, and their exercise of free speech is not really free speech. So I think that's one element of it. But it's also, I think, free and open societies. We've had them for a very short time. Even if democracy goes back to the ancient Athenian one, they're delicate ecosystems, and when they're seen as not delivering underlying social goods, I think support can break down. And when you combine that with collapsing trust in institutions, in media, in politics, when you combine it with polarization and tribalism, the sort of instinct of wanting to crush the outsiders and dominate the others, and rally behind a strong man who can deliver progress and restore the dignity and glory of the nation, will, for many people, trump the idea of allowing everyone free speech.
Yeah, it's just something to. I think you're right. I think it's a multivariate problem, and it's interesting to see how we continue to evolve with it. So let's a few points of history here. One of the things I liked about the history you give, and there's a lot of it, but the thing I like is you do everyone starts with the Greeks, right? Apparently everything started in Greece. There was no human history before the Greeks. Apparently, I don't know, but I like that you start us before, Athens in the 5th century. How do you what's the kind of the infancy, if you will, with, I guess, is more of maybe of an anthropological question, I guess, but this idea of where we started to see this concept of free speech, begin or arise, and then, obviously there were a lot of great advancements with ancient Greece and how they thought about that. You can talk about that too, but just origins, where, as much as we know that's documented, what do we see it?
Yeah, so I would say that free speech is sort of instituted as a policy and civilizational societal value with the Athenians. But you might have sort of you could go to the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, where you have sort of some ideas of freedom of worship. Obviously, Cyrus was not a democratically elected leader, and his propaganda has been quite good, including in the Bible. But he was not afraid of subjecting his enemies to brutality if they did not comply. You have Ashoka, this emperor in India, who created these pillars where he basically declared that all religions should reside everywhere. So that's again a form of early religious tolerance, though very far from actual religious freedom, I think, and very far from free speech as such. Then you have had, various councils, assemblies where there, in the ancient world, where various groups have had the ability to deliberate and speak. But again, at least from the historical record, as I understand it, in a very circumscribed way compared to what you see in the Athenian democracy, where they actually have two conceptions of free speech that become essential to the national identity. I don't know if national identity makes sense for a city-state, but for the identity of the Athenians themselves, and for sort of the culture and constitution of the Athenian democracy. Mm.
Interesting. I mean, we can talk about this difference here. I thought it was interesting the way you talked about it. Is you mentioned that the Athenian democracy was bottom-up, direct, and egalitarian, but the Roman Republic, and I guess we're talking about republic before their empire or whatever it was, but was top-down, hierarchical, and elitist.
Yeah.
How do we see some of those differences? That there's a. I mean, people have written. I mean, filled libraries with this idea between the Greeks and the Romans and then the Byzantine Empire. But what is the differences, I guess, that are between the Athenian democracy and Roman Republic that are important for this evolution of free speech? I bring it up because a lot of the founding fathers used the Romans and the Greeks as a template for some aspects of democracy, and others have as well. So there's a kind of importance here. So talk about these, I guess, two differences.
So if you could sort of run, if you had two live streams, one of a Roman assembly and one of an Athenian assembly, you would very likely see a striking difference. In the Athenian assembly, all freeborn male citizens had a right to speak, and it was a direct democracy, so they could also vote. So they would deliberate on things on public affairs and politics and laws, decisions, and so on. In a Roman assembly, only the magistrate would address it. So the ordinary Roman would not have a right to speak. He could only vote in favor or against a motion. So I think that's a good demonstration of sort of the egalitarian, and I say relatively egalitarian, given that women were not part of the assembly, that there were slaves and so on. Right. But there was also of Athens versus the elitist top-down version in Rome. But there were also other differences. So the Athenians had another concept of free speech called parousia, meaning fearless or uninhibited speech. And I think you can best describe it as sort of a civic commitment to the tolerance of free inquiry and open debate. So that's what allowed, Plato to set up an academy, even though he was not a fan of democracy. Aristotle, as a foreigner, thriving in Athens, also setting up a school when he's also critical of many aspects of democracy. Lots of foreigners would settle in Athens, became an intellectual hub. And even though Socrates is famous for being sentenced to death for his words, for a very, very long time, he was the most prolific practitioner of parousia in the agora, in the marketplace, where he would sort of roast his fellow Athenians. And that was not the same thing in Rome. In Rome, they did not have a specific word or concept for free speech. It was part of the broader freedom libertas, and it protected the higher classes against the lower classes. So the Romans thought that Greek free speech included what the Romans would call licentiousness. The Romans would distinguish between liberty and licentiousness, and much of Greek speech they would view as licentious and something that should be not allowed.
Interesting, because some of the history I've read is more recently is sort of the where did the Greeks, and I guess the Romans as well, but where do they get this? Where do they get these ideas from, right? And a lot of it, from my understanding, is that there's a lot of trade going on, and a lot of this was coming from the East. Now maybe it gets filtered down, maybe all these things. Now I'm not trying to make a statement that that they don't get some credit for how they did it, or everything's from somewhere else. I'm not trying to make that statement, but that there is influence and impact. So obviously later from this, it was really nice to see you mention it, was that there is some impact of some of these ideas from the Abbasid Empire in the 9th and 10th centuries, and then I don't know if also from the Umayyad, which I think is before. But Islamic philosophers and scientists also had some really interesting ideas, and so did folks in ancient India and even in more modern times. So this isn't just a kind of
No, it's not a purely Western.
Right, yeah.
It's not a purely Western story. I mean, the Abbasid Caliphate is really interesting because, I mean, it's obviously after classical antiquity, and it's in the medieval period, sort of 8th, 9th, 10th century. And it would be wrong to say that the Abbasid Caliphate had free speech. They were, after all, absolutist rulers, but they did create, for instance, the Abbasid rulers sponsored, the caliphs sponsored the translation of almost all ancient Greek writings, and they created sort of a very impressive pantheon, or it led to a very impressive pantheon of deeply impressive polymaths that sort of gravitated towards the caliphate, with Baghdad as its center. So these were people from Persia, from Central Asia, some were Arabs, some were Jews, some were Nestorian Christians. And you also have the first medieval free thinkers of that era, people who were very daring, and they were sort of much earlier than the first European free thinkers, people who rejected prophecy, who said that, reason, not religious doctrine, should guide human decision making and knowledge. So that, I think, is an interesting story. And of course, the translation of Greek manuscripts contribute to the rediscovery of the ancient wisdom and tradition in medieval Christendom later on. I mean, it's not the sole source. It may not even be the most important source, but it is a source. And of course, many of the Islamic philosophers are deeply influential on later Christian philosophers in the West. Mm-hmm. So that's an important part of what leads to scientific inquiry, academic freedom, and so on.
Obviously, moving through time, I mean, there's so many reasons why it's important, but obviously it's important for the spread of ideas, and speech, of course, is the printing press.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a huge point in human history, of course, and then getting people literate. So, but kind of you can talk about that briefly, but then the Enlightenment. I mean, that most people know that we started to become more secular, more humanist, and these really the shape of how we see, because it's usually like, it's like that right at modernity, usually is around 1800. So you start to see it there of like what it is to be, to have free speech and free thought and things like that. And a lot of what we have today comes from this period, I guess, in a kind of, and how we know it or see it, I guess. So yeah, just you can say about the printing press, but then I guess the Enlightenment generally, how it was super important.
Yeah, I mean the printing press is obviously a huge game changer. The consequences of it are enormous in the sense that it increases literacy, it increases scientific, the diffusion of science, and it also it aids political and religious disruption. So Martin Luther, the German reformer, uses the printing press very efficiently to spread what we might his enemies might call religious propaganda, because he, unlike the Catholic Church, he writes in the vernacular, in the German language. He writes sort of short, punchy tracts that are catered to the common folk, rather than in Latin catering to sort of a learned class. And that has huge consequences. The Reformation goes viral, and that is not least due to the ability to spread it through the printing press. It's not, obviously not everyone could read, but when you're able to diffuse Martin Luther's thoughts and writings, they can be read out loud in front for groups of people who are not literate. So in that sense, it really becomes a real game changer, and that has huge disruptive consequences for Christendom, which splinters as the Reformation takes hold. And the immediate results of this is not free speech. It's rather the opposite, in the sense that the Catholic Church tries very hard to stem the tide of Protestantism, to crack down on the alphabet soup of Protestant sects that blossom as people are able to read. Obviously, they don't all have the same interpretation of Scripture, and so you have very many different Christian sects, which makes it a lot less manageable. But what you also see is someone like Luther himself, who at one point sort of advocates for freedom of conscience. When he finds out that other Protestants don't agree fully with his interpretation of Scripture, he becomes very intolerant, and actually argues for capital punishment for blasphemers. Also engages in towards the end of his life, some deeply anti-Semitic writings against the Jews for their having rejected Christ. But with time, as religious wars unfold and so on, with time, there's an increasing emphasis on religious tolerance. Part of it is probably because people grow tired of religious wars and persecution, and you can't fight. Either you fight to the end until one denomination rules everything, or you accept that initially, okay, if the king of this or the prince of this territory is a Protestant, well, then everyone in that territory is a Protestant, and if the king of another territory is Catholic, well, then everyone there is a Catholic. Okay, so that's sort of the first step. Then the next step is to say, well, okay, even if your king is Protestant or Catholic, we can allow religious minorities to live within that jurisdiction, and then then you have religious tolerance, and then you get towards religious freedom, and out of that you get more and more daring ideas that start challenging religion as such, and the Enlightenment is obviously part and parcel of that. A more skeptic attitude towards revealed religion, religious doctrine, but also sort of the authority, the divine authority of kings, and sort of the understanding of nature. And so free speech becomes part and parcel of the Enlightenment. That's not to say that all Enlightenment thinkers were very principled defenders of free speech. Many of them had, were free speech for me and not for thee, or, had free speech doctrines that are not particularly progressive by our standards, but free speech was certainly a huge and important part of the Enlightenment.
I'll give a little time in the sun here to Denmark. You mentioned that Denmark was the first and only state to formally and explicitly abolish any and all censorship of the press, which I was surprised to read. That's very interesting. How did briefly? I mean, why did they choose to take a stand on this out of all the other characters in the world at the time, and why did they say we're going to do this? What was the motivation?
Yeah, so it was essentially one man. So Denmark at the time was not this progressive secular country that we know it as today. It was a absolutist monarchy, a strict confessional Lutheran state, with very strict religious laws, a very strict pre-publication censorship. If you were to publish anything, you needed the religious authorities at the Faculty of Theology to approve it. So nothing could be published in the realm without censors going through it. Then we had a king who was mad. And he had a German physician called Struensee, and Struensee was an Enlightenment. Was smitten by the Enlightenment, by ideas from Spinoza and others, and Struensee essentially, because the king is mad as a hatter, Struensee essentially becomes the man, not just behind, but essentially on the throne, and he just begins this tidal wave of edicts and decrees that is sort of a 101 on Enlightenment principles. Free political prisoners, and one of them is decriminalize extramarital sex, all these things that are pretty outrageous by the standard of the day. And one thing he does is also to say, hey, free speech is a great idea. It advances knowledge and educates the citizens. It's a central Enlightenment principle. Let's get rid of all censorship. People can write whatever they want. So he abolishes censorship. Turns out that the Danish population mostly is not very grateful. They don't like Struensee. He's a German, doesn't speak Danish, and he also sleeps with the queen. So very quickly, Danes use their newfound freedom to publish pamphlets that attack Struensee, and basically, some of the reactions to this newfound freedom is a bit like some of the reactions to social media. Well, oh no, this is horrible, and now people are writing all these things we don't like. And ultimately, he's undermined by his own actions. There's a coup against Struensee, and he is decapitated, dismembered, and his body parts were prominently displayed throughout Copenhagen. So it didn't go well, but there was actually no full reinstatement of censorship in Denmark, even though free speech was severely curtailed. So, you can watch the movie A Royal Affair, which depicts the rise and fall of Struensee.
But that title sounds familiar. I don't think I've seen it, but it sounds familiar.
Yeah. It's like there's a Danish actor, Mads Mikkelsen, who's sort of also done well in Hollywood.
Like
he's plays Struensee.
Nice. So before we kind of end here, just one big person I want to talk about, and then we'll kind of hear with the more back to current day. I mean, John Stuart Mill is, I mean, the guy, right? I mean, he is the guy that everyone talks about and they look to, and he was, I guess when people start to talk a lot about somebody, especially when they rediscover them, 200 years later, you start to get a lot of different opinions and ideas and perspectives. And I'm not telling you to give me the codified interpretation of John Stuart Mill, but what is an accurate representation, I guess, of how he saw free speech, how he talked about it, in terms of limits and what were the threats and all that, and how does free speech and how he saw it in his day, 19th century, has that changed at all in the 21st century, right? Things aren't static, right? Things evolve and move. So is there any way of where he, as you only can in one time, you can't foresee everything. You can't see all of the things. And so maybe he, so what's this kind of, accurate way of kind of getting at the essence of what, his message was on free speech?
Yeah, so he writes on liberty in the second half of the 19th century, and it is primarily, he actually says, in that, he basically takes it for granted that restrictions on free speech by the government, everyone now agrees that is bad, and he doesn't see the main threat against free speech at the time in England as coming from the government, because by the second half of the 19th century, there had been a lot of reforms in the UK that that allowed the common man and religious dissenters a voice. Previously, there had been this harsh crackdown on religious dissenters and people who wanted universal suffrage, for instance. But by the second half of the 19th century, much of that had been reformed, and sort of reformers had won, not least using the press. So John Stuart Mill is not mainly concerned about the government restrictions of free speech. He just says, well, that's a given. Everyone agrees on that. He's more concerned about a culture of free speech, you might call it. He's more concerned about the way that majority opinion can crush minority opinion and sort of quote unquote force people into to conforming with majority opinion. And I think that's obviously something that's very relevant to discussions we have today about cancel culture and so on. That free speech is not only about the state and the individual, it's also the tendency that tyranny can be as formidable when exercised by an intolerant majority of people than as the state. So I think that's one of the main messages in his book. He obviously also talks about the importance of free speech when it comes to approximating truth. And that no one has a monopoly on truth, and that even if you are confronted with falsities, you benefit from that because you have a better understanding of your own ideas, and maybe you even change your ideas a little bit. So I think that those are some of his main contributions. When he was younger, he also heavily criticized the British government's crackdown on religious dissenters and so on. And his father, James Mill, wrote an influential tract on free speech as well. So, I mean, I think John Stuart Mill is great. He's probably not my favorite defender of or a theorist of free speech. I think James Madison is someone that I prefer. Frederick Douglass is another one whose ideas I feel more strongly about than John Stuart Mill's, but there's no denying a place in the pantheon of
Sure.
free speech greats to J.S. Mill.
Yeah, so one of the things here is kind of coming to the present here. And again, I should say, as I said before, there's lots of history that you cover that I didn't ask about, so people should definitely get the book and read it. It's great. But I guess here in the United States, so maybe just kind of give us the view of it, of sorts, is more current, more recently, free speech was something championed by liberals in the 60s, right? People know this. Berkeley was this, mecca for free speech and all these things, and these kind of old school liberals. And that has shifted over the past 60, 70 years. And now you have, the right that has embraced, free speech, or so they say. It seems a bit, for me personally, that they fetishize it a bit. And they like it when they like it. And then they'll go and ban books and pass laws to ban things like that. So it's I don't know how much they really, and it feels like it's very much in opposition to something as opposed to being for something, but I could be wrong on that. And so, and we see already some receding of that on the right anyways, as well. So I guess the question I have here is, in the moment, but then kind of you can give us the backdrop here, since you're mentioning Madison and things like that. I guess the one question I have is the United States, is a big question, I guess, and I'm not trying to boost, that the U.S. is the greatest and all that stuff. I'm not doing that. But is the United States in terms of global and history, the country that has done free speech the best, or the closest to I don't want to say a pure free speech, but where it has the least limitations, closest to the concept and the idea. And so, you can answer what you think about that, but you can give us that idea. The founders are, in some ways, you could kind of say they're anarchists. I mean, not entirely, but there's a spirit of that. It's a rebellious, and I think that was right. But our history has always been this, well, you're not going to tell me what to do, or, I'm going to figure it out, or I can do it on my own. Or there's always that kind of mentality that carries through much to today. So with free speech, how did the founders look out, at differently? We're going to create a new country, and here's how we don't want to do it, but here's how we definitely want to do it. I think people have said that the Constitution is one of restraint than it is of promotion, in a sense. But I guess the question there is in the history of the U.S., in terms of how it was designed, how it was meant to be, and then obviously there's different chapters of sorts in that history. Adams with Alien Sedition Acts, Wilson also had that, and there's been some playing with that now. But, how do we see where the U.S. sits in its 250-year history of being one of the best? Or has it been a nice experiment, but never quite where it needed to be with free speech? And, you can talk about some of the more recent stuff with liberals and conservatives. But, what in the U.S. case, what do you think of this?
I think the U.S. has been a positive force for free speech overall, and I think particularly the past sort of 80 years. If you go to 1941, FDR gives this speech, the Four Freedoms speech, where it's wants the U.S. to engage in the war and create a new world order based on four freedoms. The very first freedom he mentions is freedom of speech for everyone in the world. And I think that, with some huge exceptions and and lots of hypocrisy and double standards, the U.S. has been the main global champion of free speech at the international level since the end of World War II and what we often call the sort of liberal world order, which is currently up in the air and maybe collapsing, including a retreat by the U.S. from that position. Internally, the First Amendment, like I said, you really have to go to the 20th century before it's given any legal teeth. So there's been lots of episodes in American history where where the First Amendment has been sort of a parchment barrier, as Madison once said. But when it comes to sort of the legal protection, I think the First Amendment, as it's currently protected, is a better. I prefer that to sort of the German model or even the Danish model. But I think that in Denmark, for instance, where I'm from, there's probably, if you go to universities, we don't have the same issues that you see at U.S. Universities. So there can be other areas of free speech where other countries do well. But I do like sort of some of the central tenets of how the First Amendment is currently interpreted. But of course, there's no guarantee that it will continue to be that way. And I think the current administration is certainly challenging it and trying to remodel the First Amendment. And that's actually interesting to what you said about liberals and conservatives, because I think it's true that there's been a period of time where a lot of liberals and progressives have sort of abandoned the old school civil libertarian conception of free speech that was dominant for a long time, and sort of had this idea that free speech was being weaponized against democracy, was a danger to equality, and so on, was weaponized against minorities. And then people on the right who talked about how the left was sort of becoming the censors and had abandoned free speech to go after conservatives. Now I see sort of a shift again with the Trump administration is talked about free speech, but is doing a lot to undermine free speech at universities. For foreigners like myself, have to be a little bit careful maybe what we say. Suing the media and so on. So there's this sort of revanchist mood on the right, sort of saying, well, now we're going to give the left back, and we're not going to use cultural institutions. We're going to use raw state power to own the lips, if you like. And so what I see now is that a lot of people on the left and progressive left are now suddenly talking. They have sort of refound the First Amendment. A lot of people who were deeply worried about the First Amendment going too far, who wanted a more European understanding of free speech, are now suddenly sounding like free speech absolutists because they don't like what they see coming out of the Trump administration. And I think that's, it undermines the defense of free speech, right? When you do it selectively, hypocritically from both sides. But I think a lot of the people that I know who have sort of argued that the First Amendment embodies neo-Confederate white supremacist male values 2 minutes ago are now sort of talking about the importance of defending free speech. That just is not very credible, right? And it's going to be very easy for the Trump administration and its supporters to say, hey, here's a clip of you talking about how free speech is being weaponized against democracies. Now you're saying we need to respect it.
Yeah, I mean, my whole thing against the left, which really frustrated me and angered me for the past plus or minus 10 years, was this. I mean, there was censorship. I don't think it was in this, overly sensationalized way, but there was censorship culturally and even a little bit institutionally, where people were getting canceled, they were getting run out, they were getting from jobs and all these things, and it was reaching a point where it was ridiculous that people couldn't say anything, or they were focusing on all of these battles that were unnecessary. And I just think that it became, what I saw from, not from everybody, but from a lot of people, especially enough people in power on the left and Democrats, was just this moral, sanctimonious attitude, which is horrible. It's horrible.
Yeah.
We don't want moral high priests for society telling us what to say, think, and do. I don't want that, and I don't think nobody else wants that. So that was awful. That was terrible. It was terrible to live through. I mean, again, nobody was oppressed, but it just was annoying at the very least. It was an irritant.
Yeah.
I think what is different about what the current administration is doing against free speech is that it is more draconian, and that it's trying to use real power and institutional and state levels that is not having, and there's no discussion about things, and people are being removed, or they're gonna not get funding, or so there's this full might behind it that I think is, I would say, just as bad, if not worse. And so you see this whole thing of like, how do we not do either one of those things? And maybe my optimism here is that people will say, you know what, we did experiments on both sides and both suck. So maybe let's not do both of that and find that nice sweet spot. But that's my optimism. The last question I have for you is, I mean, we've sort of been talking about it here, but we've got the first quarter of the 21st century almost wrapped up at the end of the year, first 25 years of this century, and a lot has happened since 2000, we talked about it. You can talk about it a little bit, but we talked a little bit on the U.S. side where things are at, left and right with free speech. Europe has some tough laws. We've talked about some of that. That I think people from here in the States kind of look through the binoculars and are like, "Oh wow, it's so bad over there. You have no speech over there in Europe." And I don't know if that's true. I think that's a bit sensationalized as well. But I will grant that it is a little bit stricter than it is here. So, I mean, you can talk more about that as well. Obviously, internet, social media, these big private companies, what they're doing or not doing. People have made that comment about Twitter as if, the marketplace of ideas, the public square, which I don't agree with. I get the ideas of that. But, we have all these things that have happened and that are continuing to happen, like my question earlier about, authoritarian regimes around the world now. I guess where do you see the next battles for free speech being fought, in the next 25 years? In 2050, when you and I are older and grayer, and we turn the mics on again and we talk about it and say, well, what happened? What happened to, again, we can't know. But I guess what are the battles I think that we're going to continue to fight in Europe, in the U.S., and around the world? Nothing else to say about what China's doing and what other places in Asia are doing, and Latin America as well. But how do you see the battles that we're going to continue fighting on free speech in next couple of years?
So I think the most important thing right now is for, to sort of reverse the free speech recession in democracies. There's a free speech recession that has been going on for 15 years or so, and again, obvious in Iran, Russia, China, but unfortunately also in open democracies. And I think that's a huge threat right now, especially now as the U.S. has pulled away from being sort of wanting to champion democracy and human rights at the global level, doesn't want to fund Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia that empowers dissidents in authoritarian countries. And that really makes it much, much more difficult to fight against this coalition of authoritarian countries that are working hard to impose new authoritarian norms at the global level to deflect from their own suppression of their own populations. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of signs that democracies are going to are going to be adopting more speech protective laws. We're still living at a time where I think a lot of democratically elected decision makers view free speech as more of a threat than anything to democracy. It's not that they want to do away with free speech, but it's just that they think that, in this environment, in a digital age with collapsing trust, polarization, free speech is dangerous. It's not something that they don't want to fan the flames anymore. But
free speech is a pillar of what it means to be a democracy.
And they will say that, but at the same time, they will adopt more and more laws to restrict free speech. I mean, I don't know if you saw 60 Minutes had this show where they followed, German police as they sort of made dawn raids on apartments of ordinary Germans who had written insulting stuff about politicians and hate speech on social media. And that's something that happens to hundreds of Germans. You're right, you insult a politician, the police come up, they confiscate your laptop and your phone, and you get summoned to court, and you get a fine for like writing a poop emoji about an elected politician, right? I mean, that makes it much more difficult to criticize Turkey when Erdogan really goes hard. And of course, when the U.S. does what it does now, suing media, the president is suing media organization, that's also something that authoritarian states want to do. That just makes it so much more difficult. But I mean, sometimes free speech really is nourished by crisis, and maybe it's time for sort of a complacent Western world that has largely enjoyed unprecedented free speech for decades to sort of be really shook into action, saying, oh, okay, now we actually, we'd forgotten what free speech really means. We'd taken all the benefits for granted and focused myopically on the dark sides, but now we really see what's at stake here. That could be the silver lining.
Yeah. Jacob, so much fun talking with you. There were so many other things I could have asked you, and time flew by, and so appreciate the work you're doing on such an important topic. And you're welcome here anytime.
Thank you so much, Xavier. And let's talk again in 25 years, if not before.
For sure.
All right. Thanks so much.